be so kind, other than the speakers, to mute not just your microphone but your cameras. That would, otherwise, Tim, I'm going to be distracted by your new beard. So if you could do that, I'd be very grateful. A lot of familiar names there in the list. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I see we've got people ranging across from New Zealand and a number of other places. So it's late afternoon for them, and it's good morning for David in the UK, for example. And we are here today as part of the GARS program to talk about the impact and the economic impact of the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic on aviation. And today specifically, we're going to talk about the issue in relation to ATM, which is a particularly vexed and trying issue, I suspect, for everyone. And we've got a really remarkable panel, and I'm really very proud to say that. And I should also, on my way, also mention that this is part of the GARS series, but it's jointly sponsored by the ATM Policy Institute. And so it's appropriate to say that the first of our panellists today is the chairman of the ATM Policy Institute, Mr. David McMillan. David was previously the DGCA of the United Kingdom, and then of course the Director General of Eurocontrol. So he knows really significant amounts about ATM and the political environment within which ATM operates. Secondly, we have Xavier Fron, who is from Eurocontrol and for many years ran the Performance Review Unit, which means that he has a very good understanding of some of the figures and numbers. Louis Barbero is actually an active controller on Heathrow approach at Heathrow, funnily enough, working for NATS, but also is the president, I think it is, of the UK Controllers Union. And he is the joint author of a paper looking at possible options for ATM going forward, which the ATM Policy Institute has put on its website in a new section for other people's views and other industry views. And finally, but by no means least, Nicole Adler from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has brought, I think it's fair to say, more intelligent intellectual analysis to this subject than almost anybody else on earth. And I'm very grateful that she's able to join us as well. So with those very short words, I should have said my name is Andrew Charlton. With those very short words of introduction, perhaps, Lewis, I could ask you to start for us and just explain what the situation is like today at Heathrow. How hard are you working?
Thank you very much, Andy. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. Very quickly, before I go into the details of Heathrow operation at the moment, just minor correction. At GATCO, we are a professional organization. We're not a union. We're not a trade union. We're a professional organization which represents civil.
Does that mean go on strike? Does that mean you never go on strike?
No, we don't. I don't think we've gone on strike for a very long time in the UK, but no, we wouldn't be involved in those discussions. We represent civil and military air traffic controllers in the UK. So we have our union in the UK for air traffic controllers. There's more than one. There's a big one, Prospect. But for us, it's just professional representation of our members, as I said, both civil and military. And in terms of Heathrow, well, as you can imagine, we're not working particularly hard at the moment. If we look at the number of movements we would have on a normal day, Heathrow is about 1,200, 1,300 movements. We're down about 250, 260 movements a day. So as you can imagine, it's not the sort of, at least from an approach point of view, it's not the typical sort of 40 aircraft an hour that we would get in the middle of the day. We're more down to, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 aircraft an hour at the moment.
Wow, 9, 10 movements an hour. That's got to have an enormous impact. Obviously, it makes your life a little bit easier, well, significantly easier, but that's got to have an enormous impact on the economics, both of Heathrow and on NATS itself, which is a huge economic cost. Plus, of course, as I understand it, David, you may have a better view of this. At the moment, aren't the airlines being given free or being waived the charges for overflight and en route and those sorts of issues?
Yeah, and my understanding is that Eurocontrol has arranged a period where the fees will not be levied in the normal way. They're not being ignored. I think the idea is that they will be levied at some future point, but at the moment they're getting a free pass on their traffic control charges. Yeah,
in Europe, free pass on Eurocontrol charges.
Yeah.
Wow. So Xavier, what's the mood within Eurocontrol then at the moment?
Well, Eurocontrol is working, especially through the network manager, to coordinate the recovery of traffic. It's monitored day by day. We are now at a situation where traffic, you can see it, you can say it's 80% down, or you can say it's 100% up from the bottom where it was back on the 15th of April. So you can see the
So the glass is
half full.
so the glass is 1/5 full.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
there is definitely traffic is recovering, more or less according to the forecasts that were published back in April, but all these things are very fluid and change day by day. So they are monitored, and let's say our colleagues in the network manager act at the center to coordinate all actions with the states, the sanitary authorities, the airports, the airlines, ATC, so that there is an orderly process as much as possible.
Wow. Orderly process in what is, let's face it, a very disorderly event and an extremely unpredictable event. That's one of the great problems of ATM, isn't it, to try to bring order to chaos. Louise, I've done it again. Nicole, I'm sorry, I always call you Louise and I don't know why. Nicole, I do apologise. Nicole, the economic impact is obvious and failing to have any revenue is fairly clear. But as Louise pointed out, we still need controllers. They've still got work to do. Is this the sort of event that we should be capitalising on to try to look at how we might reform things? Or is this the sort of event where all we can do is cling on and hope for the best?
I think in the immediate times, absolutely, we have to deal with this disaster, which is global and which absolutely nobody could be prepared for. From a business perspective, it would be unreasonable. It's more than a black swan. But I think that there's been a lot of discussion about how to organize the air traffic control as an element in the aviation supply chain, which has gone through many changes since Khan's Big Bang in the 70s. We've watched privatization, commercialization of the airports and the airlines, and it's time to discuss ATC.
Time to discuss ATC. I get I mean, I understand the argument that says, look, we're in a panic. You know, we've put the word panic into pandemic, and we need to do things. But when do we get to the point where we get over the initial shock and now's the time to actually start to render change before it's too late and everybody just gets back to normal and the way things are going to get back to where it was? I mean, we all pray that the traffic gets back to sort of where it was, but are we going to miss the opportunity to make some significant change, do you think, Nicole?
I think that at least in Europe, the WISE group came up with a plan. I'm living in hope that it won't all be stopped, and they will continue. And it might take a year to sort of be back to a level whereby we can have a real discussion. But
right.
What's a year?
Remember the WISE group. What's your view on that?
I think it may take longer than that, unfortunately. I mean, as Nicole rightly said, this was not an event. This COVID event was not something that anybody was remotely prepared for. I mean, I've lived through shocks to aviation in the past. I was involved in the Pan Am 103 and what that did to transatlantic traffic. I lived through the liquid bombing. God help me, I lived through the Icelandic volcano, which I still can't pronounce. But nothing of that prepared us for what we've seen now. If you look at industry forecasts, we're talking, what, 4 or 5 years to get back to some levels of traffic we have experienced last year. I think even that is not a given. I think there are some different pressures around, regulatory pressures in terms of, you know, what are governments going to do if there is no vaccine, if there is no effective treatment for this disease? Are they going to maintain quarantine walls or some other kind of restrictions on travel which will make it so unattractive to passengers that they will not return in droves? We've seen very significant reduction in appetite for business travel among the finance and business communities, certainly in the UK. The medium that we're all using now has proven itself to be relatively robust. People tend to use it. So I think it's very hard to know when we're going to get back to those levels of traffic. And in that situation, airlines, airports, ANSPs, regulators are all very focused for the moment on protection, preservation, getting a bit of resilience back into the system, making sure that lifeline services are protected and the like. So my own sense is that people like us should be thinking very hard about how we can try and leverage this period of lower traffic to think about how we change things. But it's going to be very hard to capture the attention of policymakers and decision makers in companies, in governments, in regulators, because they're focused on how do we just keep this thing going for now.
I would add one comment to that. I think that if and when they come up with a test for COVID that can be done almost immediately, I believe that there are several that are in development. That is what would solve the issue specifically in the aviation market.
I hope that's right. I think that what's difficult at the moment is that everything remains rather uncertain in this area. And when it comes along, there'll be a world standard. We'll all adopt it, and hey ho, we'll be able to push the button again. But I think it's still the case that passenger sentiment is very worried about travelling at the moment. I mean. Louis described the situation at one of London's major airports. That's another important one that I know well. In May last year, there was 4.2 million passengers. May this year, we had 7,000. It gives you some idea of the kind of effect that's had on airline bottom lines, airport bottom lines, and indeed the bottom lines of the NSPs in the market.
But thank you. Thank you, David. I mean, you raised a number of interesting points there. One is, I think you said now's the time for survival and recovery and building resilience. But I suspect I don't know, but I'd like to think they're two different things. I think we can be resilient. I think resilience is different to simply getting through this catastrophe, if you like. But resilience probably calls for more structural change than simply doing what we've got to do. I mean, that said, yes, several million down to 7,000 is an enormous drop and clearly a terrible thing. But we've started to see the airlines go through a bunch of reform. You can argue that the system won't go through reform because apparently the Chicago Convention was originally written on parchment and is therefore immutable. But we're watching airlines restructure, we're watching airlines reshape themselves. Delta has retired all its 777s. Qantas has retired a bunch of aircraft and is looking at what it'll have to do. BA has frankly fired people. Lufthansa is threatening to do that. Why aren't the ANSPs doing that? Louis, have you got a view on that? Well,
I think the things that this pandemic has shown, and it's an extraordinary event, and I agree with Nicole when says it's a black swan, and it's true that when we look at forecasts, we never look at black swans, but if there's something we should have learned already from history is that black swans do take place and they do happen.
When you come from Australia, black swans are standard.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. So they seem to be more standard now around the world. But one thing that we've seen with this pandemic is those things do happen, and it's probably giving us the opportunity, and I know it's extraordinary circumstances, but we should take this as an opportunity to look at the system we have, at the ATM system we have. And in particular, I think this pandemic has shown how different NSPs and airlines are. How an NSP, when you look at ATM or air navigation service provision, that is a critical infrastructure. That has continued throughout the pandemic. When I read all these articles and opinions about restarting aviation, I think, well, when I go to work and I see from my radar, I see aircraft flying. So it's not about restarting aviation. They seem to use the term aviation to refer to airlines or passenger flying, when in reality, aviation has stayed there. We've had medical flights, cargo flights, repatriation flights, the services that have continued during the pandemic. But the funding Yes.
Louis, can I just probe on that for a moment? Normally, how many flights would you normally handle in an hour at Heathrow approach?
I mean, Heathrow landing rate, we always hope to be around 40 landers an hour.
And what are you doing what were you doing in the height of the pandemic, and what are you doing now?
For the pandemic would be, I don't know, 4 or 5, I would think, an hour on average.
Fozzie the bear could have done that, couldn't he?
What's that, sorry?
I said Fozzie the bear could have
Yeah,
separated.
yeah.
I mean, my dog Max could have separated those flights.
Potentially, yeah. But the problem is the airspace is there. The service has to be provided. We can't just turn it off, because even if there is an aircraft, and that is one of the limitations of ATM, you have to cater for what might happen. You can't just say we don't need controllers because there's no aircraft flying. No, as long as there is one aircraft flying, you need to have a minimum number of controllers and staff in place to provide the service for that aircraft. So the fixed costs for providing NSP are considerably large, and we have been funding a system based fundamentally on route charges from airlines. So if the airlines are not flying, but the infrastructure has to be there in place, I mean, how do we fund that?
Can I just challenge that a little? Can I just challenge that a little bit, Louise? Just a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. There's a fundamental difference between an infrastructure provider in the shape of an ANSP and the operator of a mobile asset like an airline. I mean, it's clear. EasyJet decided that it wasn't profitable to fly, so they just stopped flying. End of. But if you compare, say, an ANSP with an airport, I mean, some airports have decided they're also going to close. Just going to say there's no possibility of operating at the moment, or more likely, we're only going to operate particular hours of the day. And if they say they operate particular hours of the day, I don't know, only the morning, only the afternoon, whatever it is, that gives them the possibility to bear down very hard on cost control in a way which is surely open to ANSPs as well, if they see themselves subject to commercial pressures.
Yeah, I think, and if
David, are you saying therefore ANSPs could have shut the airspace?
Yeah, for certain times of the day. Why not? Or said
Well,
the TMA could be closed for certain times of the day.
I think, well, I would say that very quickly, because we have to also separate, I think, what's ATM provision or terminal services and en route services, because en route, you can compare an en route ANSP with an airport operator and ATC at an airport. And we can choose when a police helicopter will have to operate, whether an ambulance will have to operate, and that's where the airspace has to remain open. It's not the same as an airport, because you can, of course, you can close some airports and not operate from some airports and reduce but the airspace itself, it'd be quite a difficult position for the states. And I think that's part of the problem, that fundamentally it's a state asset. We see nowadays how one of the problems we have in Europe is the political and the national sovereignty with the airspace. So as such, what do we do when we don't have customers paying the route charges? How do we keep that working? I think that's the most important point that this pandemic has highlighted, and the one that we should be addressing, or taking the opportunity at the same time that we're having discussions about restarting aviation, as they say, or going back to normal. We should have some of the discussions in parallel about how we fund a system and a service in a matter or in a way that is proportional to who's using the service at any particular time.
But I mean, I'm sorry, Lou, but in en route, surely the aircraft can separate themselves. I mean, I'm going to get back to your point about this as a state asset too, incidentally, but because I know that's what your paper put. But in en route stuff, really, do we need full attention all the time? I mean, aren't the aircraft capable of separating themselves now?
Well, the aircraft are not capable of separating themselves. They're not capable of separating themselves. They have safety nets that would avoid a collision, but they cannot separate themselves because they don't have a radar information about where the other aircraft are positioned, or accurate radar information. So certainly at high levels, when we're looking at cruise stages of flight, the air traffic controller will be maybe managing the airspace more and not being so proactive. But those aircraft have to get up to those levels and then down to those levels through other streams. So I can tell you that the current technology in aircraft does not allow them to self-separate throughout a flight. And that's why we need air traffic controllers.
I wasn't necessarily suggesting gate to gate, but I was suggesting en route when they're up at 35,000 feet, 36,000 feet, then I think there's a very strong opportunity for them to self-separate, or certainly the best, if you like, the best you've described to me is that at the moment, basically all the time is night shift. Is that,
that's probably a good way of putting it. Certainly for Heathrow, it does feel like that. At least at the beginning of a night shift, yes.
All day is night shift day, right? But that, I mean, that has a number of implications, doesn't it? I mean, do you think from where you sit that it's possible to use this time as an opportunity to look at new procedures, to look at new ways of doing things?
Well, absolutely, yeah. So, Xavier.
Yeah.
I think in the present situation, we are in a situation where capacity is rigid and the demand is volatile. This hit us in the time when we had too much traffic and a lot of delays. We had at the same time not enough capacity, which cost a fortune in delays, more than half, 1.5 billion euro a year. And at the same time, there was spare capacity. I will show you a graph which shows it really visually. So we were losing on both sides by the fact that it's not possible or hard to adapt the capacity to the demand, as you would do in any network for the network to operate in an efficient way. You are stuck either to over-deliver capacity to be safe, not to have too much delays, or to under-deliver capacity and to reduce the cost, but then you have even more delays. And in a situation when, on the contrary, you don't have traffic, there is less traffic, you would need to reduce the production of capacity so as to at least reduce the variable costs, even if the fixed costs remain. So the airlines in the past were very rigid as well. And somehow they learned how to flex their costs, how to flex their operation, be able to respond to the demand when it goes up, and respond to the demand when it goes down, and remain, financially viable in both cases. So something like this would need to be done in ATM, and we have, as David said, a few years before us, before traffic goes back to normal. And it seems to me that would be an opportunity to rethink the system, to see how to introduce more flexibility and also scalability. These are words which you find in the literature at the moment.
Nicole, that's just economics 101, isn't it? To match capacity to demand.
So, absolutely. And we're normally talking in terms of ATC that around 30% of the costs are in fact inflexible. That still leaves 70%. Why is that not being considered at all? That draws directly from the ownership form of the ANS piece. There is no need to adapt or change in the current system that we have. That is why we've been arguing in the literature and through, for example, groups like the Wiseman's group, that the ownership form needs to change in order for us to see any change or adaptation inside the ATM sector. We can think about it in many ways. We could think about a non-for-profit organization. We can think about a private organization. We could even think about commercialization. So it remains a state entity that's leased out like we do in the airport system. The point here that has to change is that we cannot have an organization that is simply there forever. If we can introduce competition, we could maybe even go so far as to remove the economic regulation that's so annoying people and the price cuts that are currently being undertaken and this massive exercise which costs so much to the public coffers. A 5-year tender, even 7 or 8 year tender process would improve the system, would likely defragment the European airspace and would encourage the kind of flexibility that Xavier is talking about in response to real demand. That's just a suggestion out there for how we could really move this sector in a positive way. And we probably need to start moving on it now rather than later. Thank you, Xavier.
Andrew, if I may, does everyone see the graph?
Please do. I love a good chart. And I noticed too, Xavier, this chart's terrific because the line moves up to the top right-hand corner.
I'm afraid I can only see a screen that says you're started to share a screen, Xavier. I can't actually see the chart.
Well, I've got on mine.
Okay, so anyway, what this
Keep on
graph
talking,
is
don't worry,
showing
don't worry.
is the distribution of sector load compared to the declared maximum load in the sector. And what you see is there is at the same time 7% of sector hours which are overloaded and which generate delay costs. These are figures from June 2017, so it was high traffic but not too high traffic. And at the same time, there was approximately 38% of spare capacity. So if somehow it had been possible to shift even one part of that spare capacity from some sector hours to which were underloaded to the sector hours which were overloaded, we could have saved on both ways, both having less spare capacity and having less delays. While normally these things go against each other. Normally, if you want less delays, you need more capacity. But since the capacity is rigid, is managed in a relatively rigid way, and the traffic is much more volatile, there is really a room to improve. And even before speaking about models, at least the diagnostic that this is an issue to be solved is, in my view, relevant. In average, we have a spare capacity in the order of 2/3, meaning that if you could use the full capacity, if it could be allocated exactly when and where needed, in space and in time, we could handle 50% more traffic with the resources we have now. So I'm not saying it's possible to have it in full.
Xavier? Sorry, Louise? No, Nicole? Sorry.
So this is the perfect picture to argue that at the moment there is a disaggregation of who's going to pay for those delays and who's paying for the spare capacity. Okay, and the current system does not encourage a change to better handle the sector loads. And because we now are not suffering from excess demand, now is the time perhaps to change, to start to introduce the system so that by the time this story is back with us, whether it's in another year or two or whether it's down the line in 4, we have an improved system in place that will allow the different parties to enjoy the ability to increase capacity where necessary and to offer a quality service and to be paid for it, which is not possible in the current system. So the ANSPs were to better serve the airline market, they gain nothing from it because they're simply sitting on their current price cap.
Can I thank you. I'm going to come to costing in just a moment, but Xavier, at the moment, you're whoops, if you put the chart back up for one more second, sorry.
Okay, okay, sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's going so well. And David, did you ever see the chart, incidentally?
No.
Ah, that's a pity, because it's clear as a bell on my screen. Thank you. So Xavier, at the moment, your chart's got, if you like, 3 horizontal sectors. The bottom one, the middle one, which you've labelled spare capacity, and then the top line, which is delay costs. But isn't it fair to say that that middle sector there, where we've got spare capacity, could also be labelled waste? Isn't that capacity that we're paying for but not using?
Well, it's not a waste because you need always some buffer to deal with uncertainties.
Okay, all right.
The maximum load is always a bit understated because when you foresee that the sector would get 50 aircraft an hour, sometimes you get 60. And there we
Okay,
come
so
to safety
you've
issues.
just provided an example where the misalignment there between 50 and 60 is about 18% if you're going that way, or 20% the other way. But the wastage here seems, between average load and maximum load, looks closer to 44% or 41%. So, I mean, it's a really quite high. I mean, I accept your point that there's got to be flexibility, but there seems to be a fair bit of flexibility in that chart. And then my second...
If I may, Andrew.
Please, yeah.
This, we have an issue because for the moment it's not possible to transfer capacity in space, or it's very difficult. It's only by voluntarily delegating a sector, for example, to a neighboring center, that you could do it, but this is really at the margin, but it is not a standard. Well, if you look at other sectors like electricity, in the electric sector, it's a fundamental issue to balance supply and demand, otherwise the network simply explodes. Okay. Here we have the luxury of being able to live with spare capacity, but if I may take an analogy with aviation, is as if you flew an aircraft with constant thrust and try to regulate the speed with air brakes. Any pilot will tell you this is a huge waste. So somehow we would need to identify a way where we can flex the capacity up and down, and not only flex it, but move it in time. And that's possible to an extent through state-of-art rostering with flexible rostering, where you assign the staff at the right time, at the right place. But also, and that's
so Xavier, just let me stop you there. Xavier, let me stop you there. Where are we at the moment? We are somewhere down at, I mean, Louis said we're, effectively running night shift all the time. In terms of our spare capacity, we must be down at we must be at about 20% sector load. Is that right?
I don't have the figure, but because the centers have reduced their capacity, but it's clear that there is much more spare capacity at the moment than there is in normal times.
Yeah, and just another point of clarification that's come through the chat, and if I may, I should say to everybody listening, please use the chat function. If you've got comments that you'd like me to try to weave in, I'll do it. I'll do what I can. Your load here, your chart of load is for all aircraft, cargo, passenger, et cetera, right? Business aviation.
All traffic for all traffic. 1 week in June.
Yeah, thank you. So now let's get to the million-dollar question in all of this, because I think, and Nicole, you raised it, and Xavier, you raised it as well. We look at this chart, we see that there's spare capacity which could be moved around, but it's the flexibility to do that. That's the problem, right?
Yes. So I was saying that if you have approximately 700 sectors in the European system en route. Mm-hmm. You have 24 hours a day. So altogether, there is something like 20,000 sector hours where capacity is locked, and you can have a lot of spare capacity in a sector hour and a shortage elsewhere. You cannot move capacity from one sector hour to the other. So you can move it in time slightly through rostering, but there are limits to that with all the rules to employ people. But you could also move it, importantly, in space. And that's the so-called capacity on demand that you find in the Wise Persons Group report and the Airspace Architecture study. This is a fundamental part which would enable a significant change in the way the system operates, is balanced, so it could be more efficient economically, it could reduce the delays, and at the same time be more resilient to the sort of huge variations that we have now. I'm not saying that you could absorb them completely, but at least be resilient within plus minus 20%.
Thank you. Now, Nicole, this comes back to your point, doesn't it, about ownership, and it's that how do we build that flexibility in?
So I would even go back one step further. The level of cost inefficiency across Europe is quite staggering. I participated in the Performance Review Board analysis of efficiency across Europe. We used a couple of techniques like stochastic frontier analysis and data development analysis to try and understand how the different states compare with each other. There were states, member states in Europe with 50% cost inefficiencies. And there are superb states like NATS, like MUAC, and so on, that are really, you know, using their capacity wisely and possibly creating delays for their airlines, but that's not relevant at the moment to the economics of the air traffic control system. So this is why we need to understand they're part of a chain, and we need to look at those delay costs. Who do they fall on? And how can we change this story? And one of the ways of dealing with it is, for example, changes in technology. Another one is defragmentation of the European airspace. And then the question becomes, how can we do that, given that there were laws passed in 2004 to create FABs that are still on pieces of paper, maybe. And we had the pricing story coming in 2009, incentive-based price caps, which are clearly very weak systems. Because, for example, when we can see such huge cost inefficiency differences across member states, the actual rules are we have to set 1x across all of Europe. So when we're talking about RPI minus X, and it's a single X, when you have such heterogeneity, you're going to have exactly what we see in Xavier's picture, with massive spare capacity in some areas and huge delay costs on other parts of the system down the line in other areas. And this is why I'm saying that we need to fundamentally change the system in order to improve it.
I think that it's important also.
Yeah. Louis, please.
Clearly, I mean, we have stated the facts and what the situation is, and nobody's disputing that. But I think we also have to appreciate and understand what the reasons for that are. And there is a playing field that we have, and some rules there are probably unlikely to change. And I'm going to refer obviously to the states and the airspace sovereignty and national security. So those are factors that we don't seem to be able to work around them or to sort of break through them. If we can't change that, of course, you're not going to have economies of scale, you're going to have inefficiencies, because the airspace, if you gave European airspace to a 10-year-old kid and you say divide it in areas, they wouldn't divide it like the geographical boundaries we have in different countries, because that's not efficient. But this is where we are. And can we change that? If there is no political will to change that, and there doesn't seem to be, then we might as well stop looking at that and try and see what we can do differently. Because I believe that technology can help, but technology can help not in the way that has happened, because technology has happened in silos, within national boundaries, and it hasn't achieved the standardization and interoperability that we need. Before I came to ATC, I spent about 10 years in the telecommunications industry. That's my background. And mobile phones, nobody was using mobile phones in the late 90s because you couldn't take a mobile phone from one country to the next, because every country developed their own standard. It's only when we had global standards that you could take your mobile phone everywhere. That's where we saw the widespread use of mobile phones, wireless technology that we see nowadays. So we should be looking at that. Yes.
This is a really interesting analogy, isn't it? Because what created the global standards? It was when we started privatizing the telephone companies and we created privately owned mobile networks. So maybe what we need is privately owned ATC networks.
Well, if I may, Andrew, I was speaking of flexibility. A fundamental point to achieve what Luis is describing was a standard. And not only a standard, but also a very simple obligation, which is the roaming obligation. When you are customer of, let's say, Orange, you can reach the customer of any other provider. And in the same way, you can be reached by someone who is with any other provider. So there was a requirement, which is a very simple requirement, that's called roaming, which obliges the operators to interconnect. And with the ATC systems, they are not interconnected, except in very archaic ways. If you were, as the Wise Persons Group report advocates, you have data service providers which are separate from the operational service providers. Then you have the technical infrastructure which allows this flexibility. So to me, that's a fundamental point, to have the technology and the rules like roaming, the equivalent in the telecom, on which people can build, and that it goes.
I agree. I think Xavier makes a very interesting point. Oh, sorry, David, you wanted to?
No, you're
David,
on, Lewis.
and then back to Louis. Sorry.
I was just going to say, if you're a regulator looking at your needs in your country, what should you be looking for? You should be looking for a safe system. You should be looking for a reliable system. You should be looking for a system that provides you adequate capacity. You should be looking for a system that is acceptable to the users and produces acceptable prices. Now, all of those things are completely compatible with any model of ownership you like to name. But you do need to be very clear that that's what you're trying to do, rather than trying to maintain employment in a particular place or support particular companies. But I think this flexibility thing, which Xavier has talked about, is really important. But it cuts both ways. I mean, one of the issues we debated long and hard, without coming to a particularly sensible conclusion in the Wise Persons group, was whether it is sensible to always meet demand at whatever time of the day, whenever it's imposed by potential users. And I think where I've got to in my own thinking about this is that you need to have a system of contracts between those people who wish to purchase air traffic navigation services and those people who are able to provide it. But because of the complexity of the markets in various regions, I suspect that what you need is some kind of broker. So you have somebody in the center of the system which buys base capacity, which you have to have everywhere. Base capacity is absolutely essential. But then in order to make sure you provide enough capacity, but not too much capacity, you have contracts for what airlines want to use at what time of the day. And if they don't use it, they still pay for it. And if they want to use more than they paid for, they either don't get it or they have to pay a premium in order to persuade somebody to come up and provide them with that capacity. We've got to have some system which makes it worthwhile for the ANSPs to provide capacity. At the moment, I have some sympathy for ANSP management when I listen to this conversation, and sometimes to myself. We're saying to them, you must be flexible, you must do this, you must do that. Where are the incentives on them to do these things? We need to give people incentives as well as sticks.
I think, and again, and I seem to have been the same thing, but then we're going back to the States, because what you were describing to David sounds a bit like the electricity market in Europe. But if you look at the electricity industry in Europe, there is a strong European regulator, and that regulator supervises the different national electricity market regulators, which is something unthinkable here. We don't have a strong European regulator in ATM. We have regulators in every state with decision-making powers, which is not quite the way it works in electricity. So we go back to the airspace sovereignty, and I'm separating quite clearly what's en route from terminal services here.
I always used to, in Eurocontrol, try to ban the use of the word sovereignty, because that word sort of bedevils every conversation that we have about this. I think what we need to persuade sovereigns is that you can exercise that sovereignty individually, or you can pool it in order to achieve a greater goal. And in aviation, there's always going to be the security and military aspects, which mean you have to have particular precautions in place. But there are huge benefits in having a network approach, which is a proper network planning and network contractualization would give you huge benefits, which would be to the benefit of most, I accept, not of all players in this market. And that's what we should all be using this period to advocate for, in my opinion.
Nicole?
So I hope it's okay, right? So I want to take David's point and say, I think the most interesting part is Heathrow Airport is no less important within the British system and Gatwick and so on than the en route airspace. And yet the governments in the UK and in Sweden and in Germany and in Spain have allowed the airports to now search for their own providers, to set up a tender system and to choose those that are providing either the lower cost or the higher quality, that they're looking for. So I understood, for example, at Gatwick Airport, they were looking for higher capacities than a certain provider was willing to offer or promise. And so they chose a different provider that came from a different member state in Europe. I think it's very interesting to consider, well, why are the airports the first ones to start introducing this system? Okay, and that's because they are now private companies, and they are very interested in how their system works, how efficient it is, and the level of qualities they can offer their customers. There is no reason to not do the same in the en route level.
Well, hallelujah. But there is no reason not to do it. But you could also take I mean, perhaps one of the most efficient airports in the world is Changi, which is wholly state owned. Is ownership really that important?
Changi is a fascinating example, right? Because it belongs to a state that's essentially an island that without aviation would not be able to support its high-tech sector. So the Singaporean government has identified this as being a very important support industry. And I understand, I have yet to visit, that it's a very beautiful airport and it offers wonderful services to its airline. That's not to suggest that it's necessarily cost efficient. What we're doing is trying to find a balance across Europe. And to do that, the system has to change because clearly it is highly cost inefficient. Clearly, the kind of services that the airlines are looking for are not being met. And it is the ANSPs that are going to their governments and demanding that they be protected. And this is why there is no change.
So just allow me to play devil's advocate for a moment there. Changi is really good because it gets excessive amounts of state aid, is what you just said. The government's decided it's going to protect it at all costs. But yet we don't want state aid in any other part of the sector. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's a choice about the level of externalities being offered by the industry. And so each government should be allowed to make this choice. Clearly, for example, Greece is responding differently to the current pandemic than other countries are. We can see some countries that are pumping huge amounts of money into the airline industry. Some countries have renationalized their airlines, and other countries have allowed the airlines to go bust. This is an individual choice of each country as to how they respond to this pandemic. In the longer term, do we want a cost inefficient system that creates huge delays for consumers and for the airline industry because of the way the ATC system is set up?
That's a question for you, Louis, isn't it? Do we want a system that's enormously inefficient?
I definitely don't want a system that's inefficient. And I think that if we had concentrated in recent years in simplify and optimize the system we had, we would be in a much better place. But we have two main problems here. Is that we are in an industry where, as Xavier shown with his slide, we have to be there for the worst case scenario, or we have to be there in case of. We can't just shut sectors down if the traffic is not there, because the traffic then can turn up, or an unexpected event might take place. So the problem is that we don't have a match between the cost drivers and the revenue drivers.
And yes, we don't. Exactly. And that's exactly what Xavier's chart points out. But the reason why we don't do that is because we don't seem to allow one provider who's at a very low level of capacity at the moment joining with another provider to share the delivery of that half service. You know, two people doing it half each could be one person doing it, or 5 people doing it at 20% could be one person doing it. We don't, in any other market, in any other trade, we would allow that sort of stuff to happen. And or to put that back into the language Xavier was using, we could start to align capacity and demand. But we seem to find...
If I may, Andrew,
Xavier.
Yeah, Andrew, it's not aligning capacity and demand, it's matching supply and demand. It needs to go both ways. So you need to raise the capacity to the level that is reasonable, but you also need something on the demand side. If you look at the electricity market, that's exactly how it works. There are signals to the suppliers which tell you, you have to provide this profile of capacity during the year. There is not just one figure which tells you there should be no more than so many capacity shortage in the year for the full country. No,
So
it's a
Xavier,
contract which is what.
Xavier,
Let
let me come back onto that. And what you're saying then is that the airline should be required to pay a certain amount, because
Not
at the moment
necessarily.
the airlines are indicating their demand by parking aircraft and blocking up Heathrow's second runway. Should there be some sort of base amount that the airlines have to pay whether or not they use it? Because I think that's what you just said.
No, what you want is to have economic signals both ways. So give a signals to airlines that in order to match, you have a choice to move in time, you get a delay. You have a choice to reroute. Maybe you have a choice to schedule later if that goes as far as that. So you shift the schedule so as not to overload ATC in the long term. So, and the demand, on the demand side, the balance could be done at a strategic time when the schedules are done. It could be done when the seasons schedules are done, etc. So there are ways to adapt the demand, again, by having delays, by rerouting. For the moment, delays are mandatory, rerouting is optional. You would imagine that at the end of the day, the network manager comes and say, for the benefit of the environment or for the benefit of the network, this flight will go round. For the moment, we only have very rough means, which is the RAD, where you have to reroute the whole flow. And that was done in 18, 19, but it was not individual to each aircraft. And on the capacity side, you also want signals to the providers to flex, to adapt their capacity, possibly to come into agreements with their neighbor, which says at night, we operate just one center out of two. There are ways to flex the capacity up and down if it's well organized and foreseen in advance.
Of course. David, and then Nicole, please.
I do think that what we're all talking, or we're all seeking for, is some kind of better coordination or planning of the system. If I agree with Xavier, you need to have constraints, you have incentives on both sides of the equation, on the side of the people who are providing the capacity, and on the side of the people who are using it. Obviously, in aviation, it being a very dynamic industry, you have to have some flexibility within that. But I think there needs to be a better planning so that people know what they're having to provide and people know what service they can expect. And if we can get closer to that, we'll get closer to a better system.
Nicole?
So in order to undertake what David and Xavier just said, we're talking congestion pricing.
Of course
so
we are.
We're talking about standardized markets. And
Absolutely.
as long, Xavier disagrees, but that is the way of signaling both to the supplier that there is a lack of capacity and for them to know whether it's worthwhile investing in serving that peak demand, and for the customer to understand too. The airlines are very good at charging more for flights that have higher demand. They know precisely when they want to fly according to their demand. And this is a supply chain, and we need to make sure that we don't have the bullwhip effect, but that everybody understands how this process works. But as long as we have state-owned agencies, and we have a price cap that does not consider quality or congestion pricing, nothing is going to change. And that is a mistake, because we've seen it in so many other industries that it's time to move on. We can see where it's worked. We can learn from other industries how to handle network industries, how to handle congestion and delays, and to ensure, for example, that CESAR is not siloed technology, because those privatized enterprises will be looking at how to deliver efficient services. They will want to win more than one airspace in order to better handle the capacity issues. And the answer is clear. And it is unclear why we haven't moved there yet. And now is the time. We can use now, when we don't have these capacity issues and these delays, to allow these companies to be set up and to allow the tender system to be clear, and then allow them to price accordingly.
And the regulation has been inefficient. Sorry, Andy.
No, please.
It's been inefficient in a couple of ways. Obviously, the pricing scheme prevents any sort of modulation of charges or congestion pricing, which if we wanted NSPs to behave in a more competitive way, in a more market way, we're not following the law of supply and demand and how that affects the price of goods, because obviously airlines would oppose to that. At the same time, by having a regulated framework where we want NSPs to be in a way commercialized or corporatized, not necessarily privatized, but then there is a limit on how much profit they can make. Beyond a certain percentage, it has to go back to the airspace users. So it's not a really commercialized world, which then has created another trend, which is NSPs becoming ATM development companies and going from the regulated part of the business to the commercial part of the business. And by doing that, NSPs develop their own systems. So we are, in a way, shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of standardization and interoperability, because they're going to develop their systems for their own operations, with the hope as well that they're going to be able to sell that to other smaller NSPs. So the whole performance and charging scheme has created all those behaviors that are not enable having an efficient system, which is why we're advocating, certainly from an operational point of view, that we need to sit down and have a long, hard look at the performance and charging scheme and have those difficult discussions to create a system that is sustainable, not just when things go well and this smooth changes in traffic up and down, but in all circumstances. Because some of the other things I've read in the last couple of months is the claims that the current legal framework did not envisage current circumstances, which is not correct. The current legal framework looked at the circumstances and said, beyond 10% change in traffic up and down, we go back to full cost recovery. And at the same time, it's never happened before, so it probably won't happen. Those were the discussions that were being had at that time. And lo and behold, that has happened. So all those behaviors that have sparked from this performance charges scheme are what are limiting our system. So let's go back to the scheme and let's have a proper good think about it.
Okay, so thank you. That's very helpful. Two comments on the pricing. I guess the first one is, I think, would anyone disagree with the statement that the way we're doing it on a full cost recovery basis at the moment is beyond weird? I mean, if 100 aircraft go through the airspace, we charge them €1 each. If one aircraft goes through the airspace, we charge it €100. I mean, that strikes me as really odd. But secondly, I'm also really interested, and David, you might have a better vision of this than the rest of us, why the airlines are so resistant to differential pricing. I mean, airlines are built on differential pricing.
Andrew, I've always found it quite difficult to see inside the minds of our airline operators on this. I remember at the very beginning of my time in Eurocontrol, I was sitting at a departure lounge, I think at Heathrow, and the Director General of one of the big European airline associations came up to chat to me. He happened to be on the same flight. And he said, look, I'm going to say something which I will deny later, which is please ignore whatever I say about reducing capacity in the system. We'll keep getting costs under control. Because I did that to one of your predecessors a few years ago. And he heeded me and he paid attention to me and they cut right back on investment and they stopped all the recruitment and they stopped all the training for a period because we were in a hard time as airlines and we didn't have the money to pay the fees. And the consequence of that 4 years later was demand came back and there was nobody there to provide us the capacity that we needed. So I do find it quite hard to understand why airlines are quite so short-term in their thinking. I think we need to educate them. We need to educate our political leaders that, you know, if you have a properly regulated market where people have the normal suite of incentives to behave commercially, they will understand that behaving commercially does not mean that you try to invent all your own systems yourself, that you go out there and you buy the systems you need at the most competitive providers that you can find, and you match supply as best you can to demand. and you know that you're going to have a series of market incentives and market signals to the people buying your services that will ensure that most of the time, in most places, the market works tolerably well. What I would say in this regard, the word technology has appeared in this conversation, but not very much. I think it's very important that we follow some of the recommendations in the Wise Persons Group from Europe and try and facilitate technology change in ATC, because I think that technology may be one of the ways that you break down barriers as neighboring countries decide, or neighboring providers decide to get together to do training together, they get together to acquire technology together, they get together to plan things, and you have a much stronger network planning role, network manager role, to try and drive the whole system forward as a network, as opposed to a patchwork with each individual CEO or CFO trying to optimize their business. End of homily.
We're going to come back to the network manager and all those things. Nicole?
So I like that conversation very much, but as long as we have the Polish ANSP requiring their controllers to speak Polish, and we have all of these interesting blocks in the system, we're going to continue to go nowhere, unfortunately. I would also add that airlines are against differential pricing, mostly because they don't want more competition. They don't want other airlines coming in, and that one could argue, well, who's for a third runway at Heathrow, and who's for it and who's against it is blindingly obvious based on who feels that they're going to have to compete more or less, which is why we need to not necessarily think only about the airlines, but also think about the passengers, the consumers. And this is, of course, a requirement at the regulatory level.
Sorry, the who? The what? The passengers? Wow. Gosh, there's a concept we don't normally talk about around here, let me assure you. So let me see if I can summarize where we've got to so far. Louis, I think, says that there are sovereignty rules getting in the way of stopping us from being completely flexible. Nicole is saying we need to somehow or other find ways to find that flexibility anyway. Xavier is saying that we have this terrible mismatch between capacity and demand, both up and down, and therefore we need a lot more flexibility, which brings us to David's point that we need to think about this as a network, and to therefore, in the European context, and I do appreciate this is a very European conversation, of course, isn't it? Because I don't think we're having the same debates in, for example, Canada or Australia or places with really large pieces of airspace. But David therefore thinks that we need perhaps to think about the network management role, which of course is the role that one of the roles Eurocontrol plays. Is given that we are where we are and we have what we have, which includes perhaps the lack of political will for changing the sovereignty stuff. David, is the network manager the only way forward? And then secondly, Louis, do you agree with that? And thirdly, Nicole and Xavier, is there some way we can, within that structure, still find a way to bring a lot more flexibility and sensible delivery into all these games? So there you go. Everyone's got a question. David.
Okay, well, the network manager is a good way forward. It's a way of trying to get to better coordination, better planning, better delivery on a network basis in a situation where you are dealing in Europe with 41 individual states. Of course, within the European Union, which my country is no longer a part, you can have other mechanisms, a common regulation scheme and so on, which could be adapted, isn't very well adapted at the moment, to try and drive some of these changes. But I think what we have to live with the legal framework we have. On that, I agree with Louise. I spent many years trying to persuade political leaders that sovereignty is a concept which should be weighed along with many others when you're trying to decide aviation policy, and in particular ATM policy. But given that's where we are, I think a coordinated network management approach with actually a much more empowered network manager, helping to drive network performance, helping to drive network planning, having to drive network coordination, and ideally, in my opinion, acting as some kind of a broker for marginal capacity is something which I think would be really worthwhile to try and do. And you, Andrew, just on your, this is a very European conversation, it is, but let's also forget that in global terms, it's quite straightforward to identify where major global flows of traffic are. At the moment, those flows are not particularly well coordinated. There could be a role for regional organizations or a regional process for managing those flows more efficiently, which would give you a better outcome at departure and origin airports and a better passenger outcome as well, and to take up Nicole's point. So
you mean the interface between, for example, Europe and the Middle East or Europe and America?
For example, yeah, for example, yeah.
Louis?
Yep, I would say a more empowered Eurocontrol could go a certain way, but again, we're going back to the states. That has to be agreed by the states so that Eurocontrol can behave more like a European electricity broker at European level. So that's one thing. At the same time, sovereignty is one aspect, national security is another one. Because if we look at the airspace in Europe and the position of the military areas, the many discussions we've had about if we move all those military areas away from the center of Europe, we will have a much more efficient airspace. Try and get the military to agree to that. I mean, that is another aspect that we just have to accept is the way it is. And if we accept those things, there are two main things left, which is technology, but technology not in a fragmented and silo development that we have seen so far. Technology to make systems interoperable, to simplify the task of the controllers, to make process more standard, even procedures in different countries. All that can happen while accepting the state the impact on the system. And also the funding mechanisms. How are we going to fund this system? What is a sustainable way of funding this system? And then we can do that with the states, with the airlines. The paper that we published, GATCO and DATCA, the Danish Air Traffic Control Association, we talk about the different options. And maybe, since we've identified that NSPs need to continue to operate through a worldwide crisis, then we need to have some sort of state support that funds the minimum level of service required. And beyond that, then we start looking at the customers we have and we charge them proportionally. So I think the pricing, the funding mechanism, and the technology used in a way that supports and enables standardization are going to be more helpful in the long term than trying to get Eurocontrol to have more power.
David, were you going to say something?
I'm not sure it's an either or, frankly. I think we need to try and encourage technological conversion so that people can share traffic between them when that becomes politically acceptable. And we need to have more central coordination. I think talking about Eurocontrol having more power and positing that as a problem for the states is actually the wrong way to think about it. Because Eurocontrol is the states. I mean, Eurocontrol is an intergovernmental organization formed of 41, or is it 42 now, states. And they have chosen in the past through the Central Flow Management Unit, through the route charging system, to pool sovereignty in ways which has given everybody some advantages. It's always a controversial organization because sovereignty is this bedeviling factor which we keep coming back to. But as Louis says, if we're going to make change, it has to be something which is agreed. It has to be agreed by politicians. It has to be something which the politicians will advocate and will sell to their military providers and their civil providers and their civil and military users. It's not impossible. It's been done in other sectors. I know aviation is always a little bit different, but it's not so different. We can do this.
Yeah, Lewis, the paper you and Tom wrote, in fact, comes out of an assumption that because air traffic control is a fundamental service, because we've got to stop aeroplanes from banging into each other, it has to be done by the states themselves, and that we can't get around sovereignty. But surely we could argue, and David in effect has said, you know, there are different ways we can address the sovereignty point, but then we can also look at things like banking. I mean, banking is much more fundamental to the world economy than aviation. And I know that's going to upset everybody listening because we all work in aviation. Therefore, of course, we think what we're doing is important. But banking is much more important than aviation. And we managed to do that without state-owned banks. I don't think the ownership, which seems to be where your paper keeps coming back to, necessarily is where we should have the conversation. And having thrown that bomb in, I know that Nicole's waiting to speak. So let me ask Nicole to
very quickly though, and very quickly though, because of that comment, I think the paper doesn't take any sides actually. If you read the paper provides the three clearest options and say, well, we need to have those discussions. And I think ownership to a certain extent is almost irrelevant. Whether it's a private company or a state-owned company or a government department, it's about how we fund that system. That's the key question now. The ownership itself is a different matter.
Let me interrupt now and come back quickly. That's really important, and I think, thank you, that's very helpful. Ownership isn't the matter, isn't the issue. And David has pointed out that there are all sorts of ways we can kill the sovereignty cat, if you like. There are more ways to kill sovereignty than just by choking it with peanut butter, I'm delighted to say. So that's a good start. So now, as you very rightly say, it's how do we fund it? That's the big issue, right? So I can't think of a better introduction to you, Nicole, than that. How do we fund it?
Okay, so first of all, definitely not with public money. There is no need to use subsidies to fund. This is a service that can be paid for by the users, and there is no need for handling it in any other way. Second of all, we definitely do not want a single provider in Europe. That would sort of lead us down the road of what we see in the US, which is, by the way, more efficient than the European system, but still definitely incredibly inefficient. And so we actually need to change the legal structure in order to be able to move this on. And that's where I would depart with David, I guess, and mostly with Luis, because ownership is the reason why we see how these organizations are behaving. No one forced the NSPs to go buy specialist software. No one required them to do that. No member state has any understanding of what equipment you guys are buying. It is a choice, and it is driven by who the owner is and how the unions behave. And without changing that fundamental story, we will not be able to reorganize the ATC system to behave in a way that we need it to better match the requirements of the aviation supply chain and the consumers or passengers that are ultimately being served. We want to enjoy the externalities that are driven by aviation. We want to enjoy the connectivity that we get from this service. And we need to figure out how to do it so that it serves the European markets sensibly. It can be funded within the system, and we do not need to have an economic regulator if we change the system such that it is organized more sensibly.
David?
Look, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm a firm believer in privatization of the sector if it can be done. I have lived with this since the 2000 Transport Act in the UK, when I was part of the team that launched the NATS public-private partnership. So I completely buy the advantages of privatization. But as a comment, if you look at where the main airline associations are now, they're even opposing the privatization which has already taken place of airports. They seem to want to drink at the trough of public subsidy via ANSPs and airport provision. And I completely agree with you. This is a market, this is an industry, which in normal times can be user funded, and there's no need for subsidy. There are obviously times where there are difficulties, such as now, when all industries need to have some help and need to be supported for the public good. But this should be an industry which can fund itself, can provide its own infrastructure, can have a level of public service which is exactly what we all need. But we need to free the industry up from the shackles of regulation to make it happen.
I think one quick point there, Andy, if I may. Nicole said that we shouldn't need the state funds and the users should pay for the service. But who are the users then? Airlines are one set of users, but they're not the only users. And ICAO already says that we should avoid subsidizing different user categories, but at the moment we are. And I can have some sort of empathy and understanding for the airlines, because they're saying, why do we need to pay about 90% of the revenues of NSPs when we're not flying? But who's going to pay? You want general aviation, which is the test bed for future pilots and the future of aviation, to pay for the services they get. Police, air ambulance, then the state should pay for those services. So when you say that the users need to pay, it's fine, but then we need to start charging all the users, so we don't have cross subsidies from airlines to be able to provide the service to the other airspace users.
Agreed.
Then at some point it will fall back. It will fall back on the state.
That is an excellent point.
Yeah.
Xavier, you've been very patient there.
Yeah.
Everyone
Andrew,
agrees.
if I may, it's not so much an issue of funding. ATC charges are in the range of 6–8% of airline operating costs, so it's not a major cost. The point is to direct the attention to the right issue. So to have the pricing mechanism which gives the right signals to everyone, for the providers to deliver the right capacity at the right time, for the users to accept to move where it's needed, for the airport operators to put in place the right capacity, for the technology provider to provide the technology that is needed to operate the network in an efficient way. And as we saw, being able to share information, to transfer, for example, capacity. For this, you need virtualization. You don't want silos where everyone builds a system that absolutely does not connect with the neighbor. This goes against everything. So what we need to create is a structure which drives the performance of all the players towards the desirable end goal of the community, which is to have an efficient air traffic management system.
David?
Yeah, Andrew, I see that there's quite a few comments on the chat, and Louis raised it as well, about who's going to pay for ANS services when there is no traffic, such as happens at the moment. And to my mind, that's another reason why you should have commercialized stroke privatized operators. If they are behaving in a sensible way, they have a proper business plan, they have a proper business on which they can plan in the future. If they have a period of no traffic or a period of severely reduced traffic, as you have seen at the moment, a robust company should be able to go to the commercial debt markets and get enough cash to see them through to the future where the traffic comes back again. Or if that fails, the market mechanism would ensure, for example, in the UK, if NATS were to go bankrupt, there is a special administration regime which would come into place, and the government would come in and replace them with another operator. So there are ways in which you can design markets to ensure provision of supply, continuity of supply at all points. At some times, such as at the moment, it's clearly very challenging. I don't know what NAT's finances look like at the moment, but I imagine they're not looking that great. Frankly, I know what my airport's finances are looking like, and that's a difficult situation. But in the case of the airport whose board I sit, we've been to the commercial markets. We have raised temporary financing to make sure we remain in a proper liquidity situation, and we're worrying about all the other financing aspects which go forward. And we will cut our cloth in order to ensure that we continue to provide the service and that we survive.
I think one point quick about privatization is at that point is the decision making is based on cost benefit analysis, and a private operator could potentially decide that an activity that is not profitable is not going to be carried any longer. And we have the case of aviation, or in particular air navigation services, that have some social and political goals as well. When you have airport services in small or remote communities or GA, so how could we factor in, or how could we tell those private operators you still have to provide that service? Because we have the case of Highlands and Islands in Scotland, where the Scottish government is subsidising the services to those remote islands. So if we privatise all that.
But there's no reason why that can't happen. You can do it in two ways. If there's a public need for a service which isn't profitable, as in many other industries, there's a public service obligation, and you tender for those services in the most efficient way possible. And in the case of other situations, you have a license condition on an operator, as in any other regulated monopoly industry that they must provide service A, B, and C as part of their service, and that's, you know, you just make sure that public service needs are met in that way. It can be complicated, and there are always issues on the margin where you have a debate, but there are ways of doing these things.
And indeed there always have been, and I come back to it that, you know, banks are generally private and people need to move their money around. Nicole.
So the one thing I would say is it's not enough to just change the ownership form. We need a tender system in order to actually encourage greater efficiency and in order to achieve the technology adoption that we would need for the congestion we're likely to see 5 years down the line, or that we saw last summer. And so that is one of the key elements of this story. If we just create a NATS or an NAV Canada, but they're there forever, there still isn't the right system in place to encourage both the capacity increases and the cost efficiencies that need to be placed clearly on the shoulders of the ATC market.
Yeah, my personal view on NAV Canada is that they've cemented in the socialism, but so I guess we've only got a few minutes left now. Maybe I could just go once around the house and ask everybody, what sort of reform do we think is the most urgent, and what sort of reform is the most required? What's the most needed? Xavier, would you like to start with that one?
Well, to me, the most urgent, the first step, which is a prerequisite and the building block for the rest, is to decouple the technical services from the ops services. And from this, you can start to have flexibility to move capacity around. So to me, that's definitely the first one. It's in the Wise Persons Group report. It's a fundamental part of the airspace architecture study, and that's definitely should be the first part.
Okay, and what do you think is the most important change? Do you also think that's the most important?
Well, this is what I said is an enabler. Then from this, the question is to have a range of policy options, and a few were quoted, but in my book there are many more, and I'll try to write it down. The question is to give the right signals to all operators so that they behave in a way that is good for the network. At the moment, that's not the case. And these things could also go in time. So there are things which we can do now. There are things which we could do later once new operational concepts are in place. For example, there is, if we speak longer term, once you are able to decouple air traffic services from sectors, so from an airspace organization, and you move to a flight organization, you have a completely different structure, and there is research project going. And by the way, the drones will imply a move in this direction where you have trajectories organized by aircraft and also possibly connected objects.
And we'll have control by trajectory rather than by sector as well, of course. Lewis, what's your view on those two questions?
For me, two things. The most important change thing we need has been highlighted by the pandemic is the review the performance and charging scheme. And right. It has proven to be unsuitable for these circumstances. And you can see how the stakeholders, they're all pulling in their own direction, trying to protect the areas. So clearly it shows there's a scheme that doesn't work for everyone, or when in times of crisis, people cannot come together and work collaboratively. So I think that's the most important change. And then another one that I would like to see is for technology, have complete change in the approach to technology development. So it's not a fragmented, but a standardized development of technology, because that's how us controllers could benefit on our daily operation. And if we benefit and our job becomes simpler or our workload reduced, we can certainly then provide that capacity that is latent. There is capacity in the system, as Xavier shown, it's just not in the right place and not at the right time. So technology would be an enabler, but certainly changing the way it has been developed so far in silos.
Right, okay. Nicole?
Okay, so I would personally disagree with Xavier. I think that decoupling this industry has been done already. We have our NSAs in each member state. What did they do? They just added another layer of bureaucracy. Where do they draw their stuff from? From the NSP. So they go become the regulator for a couple of years and they go back to the NSPs. There are far too many layers. And so decoupling technology from the NSP is not necessarily, it's just going to create another layer, in my opinion. I would say we have a pandemic once in 100 years. Please God, that's quite sufficient. So in response to Louis, I would say, yes, you guys probably need some help over the next year, just the same way as all other industries are needing this help. But now we need to think beyond this immediate pandemic, which hopefully will not, you know, Spanish flu lasted for 2 years and then it did finally go away to a level that we can handle it. So what we need is the Eurocontrol certifying companies, European companies, companies that the military can also talk to, companies that are acceptable to the member states, and the member states need to set up tenders. And they need to create this service and do it now rather than in another 100 years. Or when the drones service overtakes the current system and it becomes simply unnecessary. Or at least until we can move towards trajectory-based services. As long as we have this sector-based story, we definitely need to move in this direction in the same way that the airports are doing in many countries across Europe. It would also help down the line with the trajectory-based services.
Well, it would, wouldn't it? David?
It's very difficult, Andrew, to sort of condense all my many and complicated and no doubt overcomplicated thoughts and all of this which have developed over the years. But look, we need to have a better focus on providing a network service. We need to have that network service facilitated by better technical and operational coordination. We need to have it facilitated to the extent we possibly can by using market mechanisms where they're available, by contractualizing where we can do it. We must make sure that we decouple the geography and the provision of supply so that we have the increased possibility to flex capacity where we need it. And we, above all, to make sure we don't frustrate the new entrants coming from the unmanned side of aviation, because I think the pressures they will bring to the system will bring radical change as well.
You may have thought it difficult, David, but you did a remarkable job, if I may say. So we've come to the end, ladies and gentlemen, and I think if I could put it to you this way, apart from ownership, technology, decoupling, networking, standards, pricing and competition, we've practically got nothing to think about. I think that's probably a fair summary. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today and listening. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it useful. I'm very grateful for your comments that you put into the chat. I apologise that I didn't invite you to do that, but I see very few of you felt the need to wait for an invitation to put your comments in the chat, and I'm extremely grateful that you did that. I have two more things to do. The first is to remind you that on the 7th of next month, there will be another of these webinars on the subject of tourism, COVID and air transport. And then on the 8th, there will be another topic, another webinar on the environment and the impact of COVID on the environment and so forth. So they will be, I think, well, I'm sure they'll be as content rich and as interesting as this one. And so my last job only is to thank David, Nicole, Louis and Xavier for their participation this morning. I don't know about you, but I thought it was incredibly helpful, and I wish you all the best and a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.